Okay, welcome everyone to University of Texas Energy Symposium, sponsored by the Energy Institute. I'm Kerry King. As a reminder for students taking this as a course, you must sign in for attendance at the beginning of the presentation, and you must complete the discussion board discussion session on Canvas for credit for the class. Before I introduce our speaker today, I will give a preview of next week's talk. Next week's talk will be a special talk we're calling Ask UT Anything About Energy. There will be 6 faculty and staff members that study different aspects about energy systems, so 6 of our energy experts. I'm lumping myself into that category. But in addition to me, there will be David Spence from the Texas the Law School and the McCombs Business School, David Edelman from the law school. Both of them study energy policy and regulation at different levels of detail. We'll also have Sue Hovorka from the Jackson School of Geosciences and the Bureau of Economic Geology, one of the world's experts in CO2 sequestration and storage. We'll have Dr. Larry Lake from Petroleum and Geosystems Engineering. He's also one of the world's experts about injecting and extracting things into the subsurface, in particular including carbon dioxide. So we have 2 experts in understanding geology and engineering processes. We'll also have Sheila Olmstead, who is from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and she's an environmental economist, and she's had a nice and interesting history of working, say, within the White House and in other circles related to economic policy related to energy and the environment. So we'll have a pretty strong group to talk about CO2, economics, policy, and regulation next Thursday. This is an Ask UT Anything, so the goal is to have as many students and participants as possible with questions from the audience, and we just sit up here and try to answer them as best we can. So it's an open forum in that sense, so please encourage your colleagues to come. Today we have Joni Carswell from Texan by Nature. She said not to give a very long introduction, so I will not, and she will introduce her organization to us, but just to state that she is CEO and president of Texan by Nature, and she leads their mission to bring business and conservation together for long-term and sustainable impact. So thank you, Joni, for coming today, and let's give her a nice warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Make sure you guys can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you today and engage in dialogue. Dialogue being the key word. Please, if you have questions throughout while I'm talking, please ask them. Don't wait till the end. I'd rather engage in conversation. We are all about collaboration at Texan by Nature. And particularly, if there's something that you know a lot about and have something to add to the conversation, please feel free to step in and correct me or to expand on the topic. I would really, really appreciate it. So to get started, how many of you, besides this little group right here, have heard of Texan by Nature before? So not many, which I'm even more excited to talk to you guys today and share a little bit about who we are and what our mission is. So we are a conservation nonprofit. We were founded in 2011 by former First Lady Laura Bush, and also by someone we have in the room with us today, Mrs. Reagan Gammon, who co-founded our organization back in 2011. And we exist to make an extreme impact on conservation across the state of Texas. And we believe that it's not just about natural resources, but if we can find processes and projects that are not only beneficial to natural resources, we will also be able to positively impact our economic growth, our long-term prosperity in the state of Texas, and our human health and well-being. And so we really focus on bringing all of those together. And it's interesting to me, I'm a 5th-generation Texan, but Texas is really the perfect place to bring a model of collaboration and industry and conservation and people working together to bear. So a little bit about Texas. You may know some of these key points, some of you may not. But just starting on what makes us diverse as a geography, we have 171 million acres in the state of Texas. That's a lot of land. It's actually twice the size of Germany or Japan. We have 28 million people. Our K through 12 population, our students, make up just about 10% of K-12 students across the United States. We're serving a lot of people here in Texas. We're geographically diverse, from deserts to mountains to streams to oceans to forest. We have a little bit of everything in Texas with 11 ecoregions and 14 soil regions. So there's a lot of opportunity to innovate and come up with new conservation practices that impact our future. We have the largest cities. We have the 10th largest economy in the world. The GDP in 2018 has actually reached $1.8 trillion. So massive amount of business in Texas. We're leaders in oil and gas, solar, wind, when we're looking at things from an energy perspective. We're also leaders in grocery. H-E-B was just announced the best grocery store chain, and I have to say we completely agree. They're a long-term partner of ours and doing great work in conservation. And also important is we have a lot of scientists and researchers and a conservation mindset in the state of Texas. At last count, and we did an internal count at Texan by Nature, there are over 150 groups focused on conservation in the state of Texas. Everything from big, broad projects like Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to single-person biologist teams working on a particular species. So Texas has a lot to offer in terms of broad partnering initiatives. Something else as we look at the land across Texas that's interesting that makes it a little bit different dynamic is the fact that we're 95% privately owned. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 171 million acres in Texas. 95% of that is privately owned. 141 are private working lands. So we are driving the nation from an agriculture perspective as well. Not only do we have the energy base, but the food base coming out of Texas. Massively over the last few decades, we've seen the migration to urban areas. Right now, our rural areas are about 10% of our population. Our landowners are a little less than 1% of the population. So there are a lot of dynamics at play when we talk about actually enacting, implementing, and achieving conservation in the state of Texas. So given that Texas is such a diverse place and there's a lot of money flowing through Texas with that $1.8 trillion and the business leadership that we have, it's interesting to step back and take a look at nonprofits and the way they interact with conservation across the state of Texas. How many of you are familiar with nonprofit models or how nonprofits work in general? Okay, so about half and half, maybe it's 100% and only half the room raised their hands. But just to dive in a little bit, nonprofits, of course, exist more with a mission and an issue focus. They don't exist to achieve profits, to do payouts. They don't have shareholders report to the street, etc. We have a framework in place through the federal government with 501c3 designation for nonprofit entities. But the crux of it is, as I mentioned earlier, there are 150 plus organizations that are nonprofits in Texas focused on conservation alone. That doesn't even account for all of the other social issues that other nonprofits exist to serve. So when you're looking at nonprofits, traditionally they have been philanthropic based, so they look to foundations or high wealth individuals to sustain their missions. And there's a couple of different ways they serve the issues. From the standpoint of, I'll use maybe a cancer society where they raise money to give that money directly to research. You have others where it may be a nonprofit for more of a capital type project where they're building a park. So they raise money to build something specifically. In recent years, you guys have likely heard more about B corporations. So corporations that are for benefit, they're still making a profit, but they're also trying to achieve social good with their missions and their activities. And you're seeing a little bit of innovation from accelerators and kind of all industry around social impact based businesses where more of the foundations and funding arms that have traditionally put money straight from a philanthropic point into nonprofits, they're looking for a return on the money that they're putting into social issues. So the landscape for nonprofits is changing. And I share all this to say that I look at the nonprofit space as there's kind of a set sum of money that's probably going to be put into philanthropy each year. And at this point in time, that's not serving the needs of 100% of nonprofit organizations, particularly conservation organizations. There's a lot of work that can be done that's just not being done because it's not funded. A lot of times these nonprofits are underfunded. They don't have marketing money. They don't have education money. They don't have even administration and the ability to do their budgeting and strategic planning. And so as we look at how to operate in a world where we want more conservation to take place and trying to come at it from a nonprofit model so that we're putting as much money towards that as possible, we're looking at Texan by Nature of how do you change that model and actually expand the total amount of money that is going into these initiatives. So how do you utilize philanthropy but move beyond that such that maybe you're doubling or tripling or quadrupling or more the amount of effort that's going into the issues that you're focused on. And I share all of that to talk a little bit more about the model we've chosen at Texan by Nature, which it's interesting. When I met with Rifat and team a few weeks ago, I guess that was back in December, there's some parallels with what you guys are doing at the Energy Institute and the collaborative model that you are utilizing to pull in policy and to pull in science and to pull in all of the different ways that you're looking at energy issues. That's somewhat similar to what we're doing at Texan by Nature with our model. And as Reagan and Mrs. Bush founded Texan by Nature back in 2011 and looked at how do we best serve the state of Texas, how do we best serve the 150 conservation groups that are out there, and how do we make sure that Texas is viable as a leader in all of these areas for generations to come, the focus became on sitting in the center and really focusing on things that are beneficial for people, prosperity, and natural resources in equal measures. Focusing on initiatives that are science-based, driven by research, and that you can measure the ultimate impact of what's happening so that you can start to expand the pie and you can get at that business and industry mindset, that independent mindset that's pervasive across Texas, and being able to talk in that data-driven way. So I think in the abstract for this talk, I shared a little bit about the model of collaboration and the research that shows that collaboration is typically 64% more productive than a person working by themselves. So collaboration is exactly what Texan by Nature does. We work to bring conservation and business together. We work as an accelerator for other projects. We partner with 75 and counting of those conservation groups across Texas, and we work to help those gaps in their nonprofit models and projects out with strategy, with marketing, with partner development, so that we can really accelerate the science-based measurable projects that are out there. And so I want to focus, and I'll walk through how we achieve that through our programs, but I'll focus most of the dialogue on the collaboration we're seeing from the energy industry, because over the last 24 to 30 months, we've been very focused on building up the industry side of what's happening in conservation across the state and beyond. So zooming back out a little bit, and actually I'll pause. Are there any questions before I jump into programs about data or the model or anything like that? Okay, don't forget, interrupt me if there are. I tend to get on a roll and... Okay, good. Okay, so the way that we achieve our mission of bringing business, conservation, community, landowners, and all of those groups together is through our core programs. We have 3 programmatic areas with Texan by Nature certification, Conservation Wrangler, and our Symposia Series. So the first one is our Texan by Nature certification. This is a recognition program. Any landowner, any community group, any civic group, any business can apply for Texan by Nature certification, and the application focuses on benefit for people, prosperity, natural resources. This is an example of pollinator habitat that's been put in place in McGregor, Texas, and they're proudly displaying that that entire habitat has been Texan by Nature certified. They measured the amount of effort that they put in and the impact that ensued, and that's a certified project. We see everything from water conservation to recycling initiatives, from various industry partners to habitat creation to restoration work that's done across the state of Texas as part of our certification program. Next is Conservation Wrangler. So moving beyond recognition and sharing of best practices, because we do use our certification program to share best practices for projects across the state. Our Conservation Wrangler program is more of a catalyst or an accelerator, if you will. Each year, we hold an application process that starts in November and lasts for about 3 months, and we select 6 projects that are based on benefit to people, prosperity, natural resources, but also the project needs. If Texan by Nature were to get involved, and we typically assign a program manager, so they have a free ancillary team member for consultant for 18 months, and we help with everything from strategy to marketing to partner development to education and awareness to replicating that project across the state of Texas over the course of 18 months. That's our Conservation Wrangler program, and we choose 6 projects each year to get involved with. We highlight these projects each year at our symposium, our summit, and that is actually at the Bush Center in Dallas, Texas. It's going to be on October 27th this year, where those 6 projects and then select projects from industry also present and engage in cross-dialogue leadership from all of those areas. So through our Conservation Wrangler program, wanted to give you guys an example of the amount of work that's being done across the state of Texas. This map shows 2018 and 2019, the projects that we have been involved with. And a couple of things that I want to point out, and I'll talk a little bit about industry involvement, particularly energy. But you'll notice on this list of 12, look at the breadth of what and the coverage of what you're seeing from a project impact standpoint. There is not a single overlap of organizations on that list. Each of these are spearheaded by different organizations across the state of Texas. I think the unifying thread is probably Texas Parks and Wildlife, offering expertise on a lot of these projects with their biologists and some of their staff time and research and data. But the main partner in all of these, they're all different. So you're seeing a lot of great work from so many organizations across Texas. But in 2018, we worked with everything from constructed wetlands in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to more urban project with Texas Trees Foundation and planting 80 to 100 trees on campuses, elementary campuses in the middle of Dallas that were basically heat zones. To oyster reef restoration in Sabine Lake, the Playa Conservation Initiative, Dark Skies with the UT McDonald Observatory, and then CIMEX and their Land and Conservation Company. A couple of things that I want to point out. The Playa Conservation Initiative, we'll talk a little bit more about, but that is something that happens, this area right here is the Playa Conservation Initiative, so all up the Panhandle. And they're working to restore playas to recharge the Ogallala Aquifer. They presented at our summit in 2018 and ended up, I'll talk a little bit more about this because I have a video to show you about this one. They are working with partners in the oil and gas industry to begin playa restoration on leased lands across the Panhandle. So very exciting partnership between these initiatives and industry. So same, the Dark Skies initiative is here all over West Texas. They are working with oil and gas players across that entire operations out in the West Texas area and the Permian Basin to change their lighting practices. So again, it's taking to make impact oil and gas industry participation. For Cemex, as you guys know, that's an aggregate, or you might know, Cemex is one of the largest, if not the largest in the world, concrete. And they actually own land that borders Texas and Mexico. And they've created an entire conservation company out there where they're restoring species, they are publishing best practices in land management, and they're encouraging additional landowners that border their property to the tune of 400,000 acres of additional property to implement the practices that they've spent the last 20 years refining and publishing as best for that desert ecosystem. So again, all of those that I've mentioned are taking industry involvement to make the conservation happen. And they were all initiated by small nonprofit conservation groups that had science-based projects that they needed help to achieve impact. So in 2019, we're working with the Trinity River Paddling Trail and using recreation as a catalyst for conservation and understanding the need to take care of our outdoor spaces. Galveston Bay, they have an oyster shell recycling program where they're actually partnering with local restaurants to turn in the shucked oyster shells after people eat. They cure them, and then they are actually the best form of reef to put back into the Galveston Bay to clean the water. So again, partnering with business, reducing costs for those businesses because they don't have to pay the landfill cost, saving things from going to the landfill and going back into the water where they should be to help clean the water and act as storm mitigation as well. So all of these projects have those in common. So getting to the Texas Playa Conservation Initiative, I want to share a quick video that describes what that project is about. Except not that.
McDonald Observatory was founded in the Davis Mountains of West Texas in 1932. The site was chosen largely because of its remote location, well away from any urban areas that might contribute to light pollution, so it's really an ideal location.
Coming out here and being able to see the sky so clearly, seeing all of the constellations was really incredible. It really makes you appreciate like nature and all of that because you're getting to see a part that you've never seen before.
Starting around 2010 or so, after the boom in horizontal drilling took off, now instead of looking to the north and seeing the mountains silhouetted against a dark starry sky, we're seeing them silhouetted against a glowing sky from all the light generated by the oil and gas related activity. It's also everything that comes with that, new motels and housing, restaurants and chain stores and so on.
There is a floor and there is a ceiling. The brightest things are up near the ceiling. And the brightness of the objects that we want to study go all the way down below the floor. So what Bill is fighting to do is to keep that floor as low as possible. That's where the discoveries are being made.
If the sky continues to brighten, then it will become increasingly difficult for us to do the type of research that we're renowned for. The oil and gas industry has believed that the best way to work at night is to bring as much light.
I'm not sure what happened. but I'll keep talking. Okay. So the Dark Skies Initiative, I did not cue it up properly, I said Playa, but the Dark Skies Initiative, again, was started with the UT McDonald Observatory, and they have a gentleman who's working as liaison between the oil and gas industry to change the practices out there. And Apache Corporation has taken a leadership role in understanding the impacts. And what they're finding is changing the lighting, so just changing to doing full cutoff lighting instead of the light going slightly up and it polluting into the atmosphere. If you face the light down, to where if you put a paper under it, no light came up from the fixture, it focuses the light down onto the work surface. And it actually makes it to where there is no glare on that work surface. So they're finding that it's actually safer for their employees working on those rigs to use dark skies lighting. They're also finding that they don't have to change the lights out as often, so they're making fewer trips to make those changes, which is saving gas and saving employee time, and they're using less electricity. So it's actually improving their bottom line to implement these dark skies initiatives. And in that work, we've been working with them, with the McDonald Observatory and with the Apache to publish a case study on dark skies so that our goal is to have 100% participation from oil and gas working in Texas, that they will be dark skies compliant moving forward. And so Taylor Keys is actually here with us. She's the program manager, and she has gotten sign-off from API and a lot of TxOGA and PPPA, and these are all of the industry associations that signing off that they agree with the recommended dark skies lighting. So between that and Apache taking a leadership role on showing the benefit to the bottom line, ultimately the research will be saved at the McDonald Observatory for the future, but also the impact to nocturnal wildlife. So that's the type of projects that we're seeing work collaboratively. From a Playa restoration standpoint, and I don't think that I'm going to have slides, so I'm just going to walk through the rest. How many of you guys had heard of a Playa before? And I'm not talking about a beach. So not the Spanish for beach, but a playa in the Texas Panhandle. Okay, so for those who haven't, throughout the Panhandle, there are thousands of shallow pits. And these pits are basically, they have silt-lined bottoms. And when it rains, the water comes through and it filters back down and it recharges the Ogallala aquifer. Well, over decades and decades and centuries of grazing and agriculture practices, these pits have been filled in an effort to farm the land, or they've had cattle trample down the playas so that the bottom of these are either filled and now impermeable, or they're almost like concrete because the cattle have trampled them so much. And so what they found is the Ogallala is not recharging at the rate that it should. And so the Texas Playa Conservation Initiative is a collaborative of nonprofits in the Panhandle that are working to restore the land. They have money available to grant to landowners so that there's no money left on the table. And they're able to restore these playas on their land back to their original purposes. And so this group actually presented, as I mentioned earlier, at the 2018 summit. And Pioneer Natural Resources was there because they were talking about their own conservation initiatives, including water recycling to lessen the impact of fracking and the water used in that, and sharing some of the innovation that they're pursuing from a conservation standpoint. But Pioneer was there, and they started scratching their heads, and they're like, well, we have leases all over the Panhandle. So why don't we go back and see if there's actually playas on our land? And what they discovered is they actually had 28 playas on their own lease lands that they were operating on. And so they have made the commitment to restore those lands at their own cost and to publish best practices to the industry so that all of the other operators in that whole Panhandle area are going to follow suit. So it's that type of collaboration and projects that we're seeing move forward as we bring industry and conservation groups together. Another note on the conservation Wrangler side, Phillips 66, another energy company, oil and gas, they actually have looked out across the state and reached out and wanted to know where could they put money to make the most impact. And so they have funded the grassland restoration incentive program that Oaks and Prairie Joint Ventures is running. And they are working to restore almost 2,000 acres of grassland prairie, which provides homes for over 600 bobwhite quail pair. So not only does that help those bobwhite quail, but all of the other grassland birds. Again, we're seeing collaboration not only from a execution standpoint of oil and gas companies going and following the lead on big projects, landscape scale projects, but also helping to fund these projects as well. So, so our final area of programs, I've mentioned the certification, I've mentioned Conservation Wrangler. Our final area is our Symposia Series. And with the Symposia Series, we work on topics. We convene people, much like you guys are doing today. We bring people together to talk about a particular project or program. And we've had a couple of topics we've focused on. The first, health and nature. We had a health and nature symposium back in 2016 and ultimately launched our Center for Health and Nature, which is a partnership between Texas A&M University, I know that doesn't make a lot of people happy here, Texan by Nature, and Houston Methodist Hospital. But we're working to advance the research to give a solid set of data that shows that time in nature is good for your health, whether it's in a clinical setting and bringing nature inside, whether it's in your work setting and providing access to nature or nature indoors while you work, or it's in a community setting and solving for issues of equity and access to make sure that everyone has access to nature outside. If we can prove that link to health from the standpoint of prevention through to treatment and recovery and long-term benefit, then we can start to change policy and we can start to change our practice of our industry partners across Texas. The other areas of symposia beyond health and nature are in the realm of our leadership roundtables. Each year we host roundtables across the state where we bring cross-industry leaders together to talk about their concerns regarding conservation and talk about their wins. And out of that, we've heard a lot about recognition. So particularly the oil and gas industry and the agriculture industry, they say, you know, we're kind of damned if we do, damned if we don't. Doesn't matter what we do, if we say that we've done well, somebody's going to throw arrows at us. So we'd like a little bit of recognition, but we'd also like employee engagement. They're worried about workforce growth in the future and having the right workforce to come in and work at their companies. So they want to be able to articulate their story in terms that the best and the brightest entering the workforce are willing to work in the oil and gas and the agriculture industries moving forward. They also are interested in trusted data sources and in ultimately measuring the impact of their conservation projects. So through all of that, this year we are focusing our series on what we call return on conservation and setting up a standardized framework for measuring the ultimate benefit of the time and the money and the effort that you're putting into your conservation practices, with the goal that that framework will ultimately help you vet projects and do more and be able to articulate those and stand behind that articulation for the stories you're telling in the annual report and reporting to the street. And so with those leadership roundtables, we actually launched the Texan by Nature 20 in December. If any of you guys are Texas Monthly readers, you would have seen 20 businesses across 10 industries doing great work in conservation across Texas, and those were highlighted this past December. So the other area from a Symposia Series standpoint is our monarchs and pollinators. We held our first symposium back in 2018. We had over 200 people and 80 organizations come together to talk about the plight of the monarch butterfly initially. Are you guys familiar with monarchs? other than they're beautiful butterflies? Okay. So a little bit about the monarch. From a life cycle standpoint, they go through 4 stages. They go through those stages pretty quickly. They go from egg to larva to chrysalis to adult. The mothers have to lay their eggs on milkweed because the eggs, when they hatch, the larva eats the milkweed. Milkweed is actually poisonous for birds, which means the birds don't eat the larva because the larvae are poisonous for birds at that point. But once they eat that milkweed and then go into the chrysalis stage, it's critically important that they then have nectaring type plants so that the adults have something to eat so that they can migrate. The migration of the monarch butterfly, they're the only migrating butterfly. They actually winter in Mexico and they migrate all the way up to Canada. And so Texas is right in the flyway. You'll see them a lot in the spring and the fall in their migration stage. And what's fascinating about this butterfly is that if you were born in Texas in the spring, you actually never see Canada and you never see Mexico because they go through generations. So the generation that saw Canada is multiple generations removed from the one that comes down and overwinters in Mexico. But each year they overwinter in the same spot, even though it's multiple generations removed. And there's a lot of research and science going into this because we don't understand why right now. We don't understand how they know to go to the same forest down in Mexico. And then there's one generation in kind of the 5 cycle phase because you typically see 5 generations that makes that flyway loop. And you see the same one that overwinters in Mexico come back to Texas in the spring. But none of the other generations in that 5 generation loop lasts that long. So I share all of that and a lot of information on the monarch to share that EOG resources, after our first symposium, and our findings were that there was a supply-demand issue where seed suppliers said there's no demand for native seeds, so we're not going to grow any. And then the oil and gas industry said they're way too expensive. We can't plant them because it shoots our bottom line. And so you had this chicken and egg. And we engaged in this dialogue, and EOG Resources actually stepped up and said, we want to help you figure that out. We want to take a lead and figure out what the real hurdles are, and we'll do it on all of our disturbed lands, the pad sites and the rights of ways, the pipeline. We'll figure out how to make this work, and then we can publish it out, best practices to the rest of the industry. So we're in the middle of a project right now. Amy Snellgrove is actually the leader of that project, where we're working within the Eagle Ford Shell to understand what are the hurdles to getting landowners to participate, because you have the oil and gas who are disturbing the land, the landowners who actually own the land and have to agree or demand certain practices once the land has been disturbed, and then the conservation groups and the seed researchers that are kind of putting information in to what's going on and what needs to happen to make sure that we have enough monarchs in the future. But more than just monarchs, pollinators as a whole, right? The monarchs have gotten a lot of attention. They haven't yet been listed, but they're almost like the canary in the coal mine as far as showing what's happening with pollinators across all of our agriculture areas and what we need to do to figure out native restoration and ultimately setting up success for our food sources in the future. And so again, it's a collaboration really unique to Texas, privately owned land, an industry operating on privately owned land, and then groups getting involved to figure out the right conservation practices moving forward. Amy, do you want to add anything to that? Thanks. Okay. So right now, the EOG project, they have 14 seeded sites and 7 landowners that are involved. They have 6 land reps that they've gotten involved in reaching out to landowners. And just last week, Amy and our other project manager, Matt Wagner, got NRCS involved as well to be part of the ongoing landowner education and reach out to get more people involved. So excited to continue to share progress on that front. But taking it back to energy as a whole, a couple of more facts. I mentioned up front that we were leaders in oil and gas and wind and solar. But something that hit me as I was looking at data, the energy industry, the latest data that I saw, $172 billion into that $1.8 trillion economy. So they're critical to conservation in Texas. And I'll send out the slides, or maybe we can make those available, because I had a great picture of oil and gas and what it looked like across the state of Texas. So I showed the project map earlier, where all of the projects that Texan by Nature is working with, and the breadth of that. If you look at oil and gas map and active oil and gas wells across the state of Texas, so imagine state of Texas, you have a big colorful swath across the panhandle, and then a big swath across the middle, and then a big swath across the south as well. And it's all these tiny little drill sites, active wells, that are engaged in taking out our natural resources across the state. But from a land perspective, it's probably 25 to 35% of the total land that is under active oil and gas production right now. So again, it's critical. They're putting a lot of money into our economy and our future, and they're critical to our success.
John,
Yes.
I just think of one thing that I might add. Kind of a shotgun, oh, sorry, I always thought I was loud enough. A shotgun splatter across the state. They create, not just for the monarch and other pollinators, but food plots throughout Texas. So I don't know, like you said, if you could have that slide where you have, if you look at the oil and gas footprint, it's food plot, they're very scattered, and that's what a lot of our wildlife as well as the pollinators need. So they're set up perfectly to be a catalyst for not just pollinator, but other wildlife and food plot initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So just from a sheer size, and even the size of the workforce and the size of what we're putting into the national and global economy, the oil and gas / energy, because solar and wind are right there too, the industries are important and really critical to conservation moving forward. And so in wrap up, I would say that today, what we need from the energy and as industry and from leaders like you is participation in these landscape scale conservation projects. Right now, there's opportunity for Playa restoration, for habitat creation, and with Playa, with Pioneer Natural Resources leading the way, with habitat creation, with EOG Resources, and even Enbridge leading the way, which don't know if you guys are familiar, their headquarters are not in Texas, but they've put millions of dollars into Valley Crossing Pipeline and figuring out some habitat needs as well. And then also into the Dark Skies Initiative. So understanding where to look from a community-based project perspective and getting involved and looping together partners on all of these initiatives, whether it's cross-industry partners and publishing of best practices or funding work that needs to be done, or it's community partners to understand what land or what initiatives need help. Those are things that can happen right now moving forward. And then in the future, I would love to see, I've had the privilege of reading some of you guys, like the research proposals, and I would love to see more and more of that research of how do we interact with our natural resources to truly hit regenerative cycles. How do we replenish? How do we measure? How do we push this into everyday practice for industry? So not only the focus on something that is 100% solution that 1% of people are going to implement, but can we research and figure out things that maybe it's a 70% solution and we can get 90% of the oil and gas companies to implement these. So continuing to have that flexible, adaptive thinking to get industry partners to move and to work with us as scientists, as researchers, as community leaders. And then I also encourage you, of course, to continue your cross-functional collaboration that the Institute is encouraging, but looking at the technology innovation piece of this as well. What can we solve with tools that we didn't have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, to make our impact on the land much less, and again, striving to achieve much more regenerative practices in energy, which is not an industry that we typically look at as potentially regenerative. But why can't it be? Why can't we pursue innovation and research that gets us to a much better place? So again, I applaud the collaborative environment that you guys are setting up, and look forward to hopefully working with you guys on different projects and leaderships and initiatives in the future. So that's it. If you guys have questions or commentary.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for that great talk. Anybody have any initial questions? I'll start it off. I think we got one there. We'll start it off. So it's interesting statistics. I know from some other people working at other conservation groups, like just the Texas chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Texas is somewhat unique in having such a large percentage of private land. As you mentioned, less than 1% of the people own 95% of the land. So getting access to the land is, for the 99%ers is hard. I don't know if there's anything else you can say about this challenge, or things that are literally about getting people just to have land to go access, and whether private landowners are willing to open up their land for certain purposes, and the public.
Yeah, so I think that the answer is yes. We're seeing that private landowners are willing to listen and to open up their land, as long as it's a trusted source, right? There are people that they're generally accustomed to working with, whether that's a biologist from Texas Parks and Wildlife, whether that's a county extension agency through the TAMU Extension Office. They are willing, but it takes multiple conversations. Don't think that it's almost the travesty of nonprofit work, right? You're like, this is the right cause, and I'm going to send this note, and this is going to happen because it's the right thing to do. That's not necessarily the path that these things take. I think, it's almost about the marketing of, this is what we're trying to do, this is why your involvement is critical, and this is what it does for people, or bottom line, or ultimately hunting, or whatever it is that person cares about. But we're finding the landowners are willing. It's getting through with a trusted agent, and creating that trust so that they're not scared it's going to be, oh, I found an endangered species on my land, now shut everything down, right? There's that aspect. But I think gaining access, I think partnering with the broader groups that are doing work across Texas has been very helpful for us. I mentioned NRCS earlier from an education standpoint. TPWD are folks that we've worked hand in hand with to develop those relationships.
First off, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is, so has Texan by Nature looked at partnerships with companies that own solar farms or wind farms in Texas? And what's the nature? What are those projects addressing, if so?
Absolutely. So we partner with lots of industry. I mentioned grocery, food and beverage, technology, and getting back to solar and wind. We haven't heard much from wind, and I think that's the nature of who owns most of the wind in the state of Texas. A lot of those are not Texas or even U.S. owned, so we've had less exposure to that. But from a solar standpoint, we're seeing advances, of course, from a technology standpoint to use smaller footprint, but also to raise the panels off the ground in an effort, and then the panels to rotate in an effort to have pollinator habitat beneath those solar panels. And so we're at the very beginning stages of suggesting that to folks who are putting in their own farms or working with farms across the state of Texas to fulfill their renewable energy goals. And then learning more about the technology and what that looks like moving forward. Mm-hmm.
How do management practices on lands that you've designated Texas by Nature certified differ from those with conservation easements? We hear a lot about various hill country properties with conservation easements, but what's the difference in management?
in management versus a conservation easement. So a conservation easement, and I want one of my team to step in when I misspeak, please. Conservation easement, or anyone else in the room that knows better than what I'm about to say. A conservation easement is more of a promise that you're going to set aside something perpetually, that it's going to be managed in a certain way, it's never going to be used differently. Benefit of that is it's more of a conservancy type model, where it's a set aside, don't touch it, move on. It's not as much of a working land type model, versus management of land and conservation practices are always evolving. And so you might do the conservation easement in 2000 and never look at it again in 2020. And as we know, practices can really evolve in that 20 years. And if you're really focused on land management practices and utilizing that land to the best of its kind of potential, that's quite different than just setting it aside. It's making a commitment and putting a management plan in place to utilize the land versus the set aside. Amy, do you want to, you look like you want to add.
A lot of times with conservation easements, a lot of it depends. I just know the work that we've done with like endangered species, things like that around military installations. Conservation easements are very effective for that because it keeps it in its natural state and doesn't allow development, because of course if you start to develop near military installations, they can't train. You know, people don't like sleeping in the morning with, you know, tanks going off and firing during training. So it's just difference in practices. And like she said, most of the time your conservation easements will leave it like that in perpetuity where it can never be changed. A lot of folks are looking at that just to trying to keep the native rangelands that we have throughout Texas, native rangelands, because a lot of that is where we get our water, right? That's where the best water enters, is filtrated through those natural environments. So that's kind of a big difference. But I think a lot of it is if you want to have, when there are reasons to keep it forever like that, in the example of military installations, those are really important. To continue being able to train and whatnot for the military, because otherwise then you cause a snowball of huge issues where we have bases that you can't train on and things like that.
Is this like follow-up? Is there a minimum size of certification or land area that makes any sense? Somebody's got a front yard, you can certify this?
When we did the certification program, we wanted everyone to be able to participate, whether you're an apartment dweller and you're setting up a small pollinator garden on your balcony, or you're a massive landowner. So there is not a minimum size. The certification is an effort to recognize all efforts, big and small, for Texans everywhere. So yes, if you are in an urban area and you're participating, please look into the program, because we'd like to recognize you, because likely your story will inspire others to follow suit.
Hi, I think your partnership with corporations is a really effective strategy in Texas, and I'm curious if you're also advocating for regulatory policies to kind of take away the voluntary aspect of a lot of these programs.
So great question. No, we are not spending time and energy on lobbying and trying to change regulatory policies. Our hope, should separate my thoughts from the organization. One, we try to stay just apolitical. We don't want to enter on either side. We want to uphold best practices regardless. And given the amount of time it takes for regulation to pass and then be enacted, our hope is to make a sea change of behavior. It's almost a competitive must. If you operate in Texas, there are certain boxes you have to check from a land management, from a community engagement standpoint. And I feel like that's going to be more effective long term, and it's not subjected to the pendulum swing of political environment and whatnot. And then just from a standpoint of our organization making the most impact that it can, you can spend 5-10 years trying to get regulation enacted and spend a whole lot of your funding on the lobbying that it takes to do that, versus spending those resources on program managers that can help push these initiatives forward. So long-winded way to say no, we're not involved on the regulatory front at this time. We testify when asked. I know Amy went and testified at a pollinator hearing, but that's not our focus.
Any other questions? One more? Yep.
I was wondering if you could comment more on those private landowners and kind of their long-term environmental concerns. I mean, is the consensus, is it water access, is it forage for cattle, just kind of, what the majority of people are really worried about, 10, 20 years into the future?
So it depends. A lot of them are worried about taxes. How am I going to pay for this land? How's the land going to pay for itself because I'm continuing to pay the taxes on it? You're going to see in the next 10 to 20 years a massive change in ownership and potential fragmentation as that land is passed down to the next generation. And so you're seeing a little bit of everything right now. You're seeing people that are on the very forefront of, we want this to be the epitome of conservation practices, and then you're seeing kids who grew up in the city, their family owned this land, and they have no connection to that land, and so they have no thoughts on what they want to do with that land moving forward. But I would say that across the board, it's the productivity of the land. Can we, through tax exemption, et cetera, get it paid for? And then the water piece of it, and we're finding as we educate, they are interested in how do I take care of this. And so, Amy, do you want to talk any more about the landowner piece of that?
Just a good resource in that is, it's called texaslandtrends.org.
Yeah.
And it's the Natural Resource Institute at A&M has spent the last 15 years studying what causes land to be converted in Texas when population comes in and the cost tax increase, when you get more for your land than you can do running cattle, then you're going to most likely sell to development. So it's a huge study, but if you're interested, take a look. They've done tons of work on, the trends of Texas land over time and what implications that has on our natural resources. Yeah.
Yeah, and the picture of the 171 million acres, that was from Texas Land Trends as well in my presentation, and it is a great resource. But Amy is working with those landowners across the Eagle Ford Shell to get them interested in doing the pollinator habitat. And there's just not a one-size-fits-all. Each of them wants something a little bit different and has different goals. We're not seeing really in a unifying thing besides, I don't want this to sink me from a finances perspective. How do I take care of it but not go broke doing it?
Okay, I guess we'll do one more here.
Hi, that was a really nice talk. I had a question about the Dark Skies Initiative thing. So I was wondering how much are the major operators like Exxon and Chevron collaborating with this initiative? Have you tried to reach out to them and all of the stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, so great question. As I mentioned earlier, Apache has been the leader, but we're super excited to be visiting Houston on February 24th, where most of those big operators are going to take part in an education session that Apache is hosting, and they're all coming to the table to learn more. Most of them, Shell, Chevron, Pioneer, EOG, all of those guys are also meeting us out in Midland, where we're going to be talking to them about making commitments to dark skies, playa restoration, and habitat creation all through the Permian Basin as well. But Taylor's been working on it for 18 months now. Very persistent on getting these folks to the table and on the phone, but I'm excited to say that we are finally hearing back from Shell, Chevron, Exxon to learn about it and to potentially take part. I think the hardest part is getting them to the table. Once they hear, it's easier moving after that. So. Yeah, it's making it standard operating procedure, and that's the next step in the process, and that way it filters to all of those independent smaller operators that they contract across all of their operations.
Okay, thank you for a great talk. Thank you for all the great questions.
Thank you guys.
again. Thank you, Joni.
Sorry about my computer.